Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're tackling some really big questions, the kind humans have always asked.
The really fundamental stuff.
Exactly. Like, what's the soul? What is the world really like underneath it all? Is there a God? Metaphysics.
The big hitters.
And our guide for this, our source, is designed to help us through a thinker who, let's be honest, can seem pretty daunting at first. Immanuel Kant. We're using his Prolegomena to any future metaphysics. It's kind of presented as a key or an extract from his huge work, The Critique of Pure Reason.
Right, like the condensed version almost.
Sort of, yeah. It's Kant trying to lay out his core ideas that twist the whole system, but maybe a bit more directly.
And the main thing he's wrestling with here, our sort of mission for this deep dive, is this huge question: how is metaphysics possible as a science?
Not just as like random ideas, but as actual knowledge.
Precisely, like math or physics, because, he looked around and saw those fields were advancing, but metaphysics, it seemed stuck.
Just going in circles.
Yeah, the source says it was like moving around the same spot without gaining a single step. No agreement, no standard weight and measure for truth. A real crisis.
And the big surprise, the sort of Kantian twist we're going to unpack, is that his answer isn't about looking harder out there at the world.
No, it's about looking in here.
Inside our own minds. How we structure knowledge.
Exactly. How our minds actually shape what we can even know. It's a fundamental shift.
Okay, right. Let's get into that. What actually kicked this whole massive project off for Kant? Why suddenly rethink everything?
Well, Kant himself gives a lot of credit, or maybe blame, depending on how you look at it, to David Hume, the Scottish philosopher.
Hume. Okay. What did Hume do?
Hume basically attacked one of the absolute bedrock concepts for metaphysics and science, too. Cause and effect.
That seems pretty fundamental.
Oh, absolutely. Hume asked, where do we get the right to say that A causes B, that there's a necessary connection, just from reason alone without experience?
Because experience only shows us what? Things happening one after another.
Exactly. Constant conjunction, he called it. We see the first billiard ball hit the second, and the second one moves, always. But we never see the necessity, the must. Hume questioned if reason could really supply that on its own.
And this is where Kant has that famous quote, isn't it? About being woken up.
That's the one. He says Hume's idea was the very thing which many years ago first interrupted my dogmatic slumber.
Dogmatic slumber. What does that really mean? What was he slumbering through?
It means he, like a lot of philosophers back then, had been operating under certain assumptions, unquestioned beliefs about reason's power to know reality directly, stuff inherited from, previous philosophical systems.
But he was just accepting things without really interrogating them.
Pretty much, taking it for granted that pure reason could figure out necessary truths about the world. And Hume's point about causality just shattered that complacency. It woke him up, forced him to question the foundations.
And how did other philosophers react to Hume at the time? Did they see the problem?
Well, the source mentions guys like Reid, Oswald, Beatty, Priestley. They tried to push back against Hume.
But Kant didn't think they really got it.
No, he felt they missed the point of the problem. They mostly just appealed to common sense. Everyone knows things have causes.
Right, which does feel intuitive. If I push something, it moves. Isn't that just common sense? Why is Kant so dismissive of that approach here?
That's a really good point. And Kant makes a sharp distinction. Look, common sense is great for everyday life, right? For practical judgments, well-considered and reasonable thoughts and words, as the source puts it.
Sure, for fixing a leaky faucet or deciding what to have for dinner.
Exactly. But for speculative metaphysics, these abstract, universal questions, Kant says relying on common sense is basically a dodge, a subterfuge. It's the wrong tool.
He has that analogy, right? The tools.
Yeah, it's a good one. Chisels and hammers may suffice to work a piece of wood, but for steel engraving, we require an engraver's needle.
So common sense is the hammer. Metaphysics needs the precision needle.
Precisely. Kant argued Hume had both common sense and that critical reason needed for philosophy, while his opponents were trying to hammer away at a problem needing fine engraving. They just weren't equipped for that kind of deep conceptual problem.
Okay, so Hume's challenge wasn't just about causality then. It was about the very power of reason itself. How does reason make these connections that seem to go beyond experience, but aren't just definitions?
Exactly. It forced Kant to dig deeper into the mechanics of thought itself. And to do that, to answer Hume and see if metaphysics could even be a science, he first needed to get really clear about the different kinds of judgments we make.
Right, the building blocks.
Yeah, he makes this absolutely crucial distinction between two types: analytical judgments and synthetical judgments.
Okay, analytical first.
Analytical, that's where what you're saying about the subject, the predicate is already sort of baked into the concept of the subject.
Like your classic, all bachelors are unmarried. Being unmarried is part of what bachelor means.
Perfect example, or Kant's example. All bodies are extended. Extension, taking up space, is part of the concept of body. You're just clarifying the definition, not adding new info. These are true by logic, the law of contradiction. You know them a priori before experience.
Got it. So synthetical must be the opposite.
Right. Synthetical judgments are where the predicate adds something new, something not already contained in the subject's concept. They synthesize new information, amplify our knowledge. Like the source's example, all bodies have weight. The basic concept of body, just something extended in space, doesn't strictly include the idea of weight. You need something more than just the definition.
Like observation, experience.
Usually, yes. Most synthetical judgments are empirical based on experience. Experience tells us bodies have weight.
Okay. Analytical unpacks concepts, synthetical adds information. How does this connect back to metaphysics and Hume's problem?
Well, empirical judgments based on sense experience are always synthetical. But the real puzzle, the thing Hume really highlighted for Kant, is the possibility of synthetical judgments a priori.
Judgments that add new information and are known before or independent of experience. How does that even work?
Exactly. That's the million-dollar question for Kant. These judgments would be necessary, universally true, and genuinely informative. They wouldn't just be definitions, analytical, and they wouldn't just be descriptions of experience, empirical, synthetical.
And metaphysics is full of claims like this.
Totally. Think about every event has a cause, or substance persists through change. Metaphysics claims these are universal, necessary truths known by reason alone. But they do seem to add something to our concepts of event or substance, right? They aren't just definitions.
Yeah, they seem to describe the structure of reality.
Right. So Kant says, look, metaphysics stands or falls with the solution of this problem. Can we justify these synthetical judgments a priori? Can reason actually produce new, necessary knowledge about the world on its own? Hume casts serious doubt on that.
So how did Kant try to solve it? Where did he look for clues?
He turned to fields where we seem to already have this kind of knowledge. Pure mathematics, geometry, and arithmetic.
Because math seems certain, universal.
Exactly. And it's not just definitions. When you learn that 7 + 5 = 12, or that a straight line is the shortest path between 2 points, that feels like real knowledge, not just unpacking the words 7 or line. It feels synthetical and a priori. So Kant asked, how is that possible?
What was his answer? How does math do it?
His big insight was that mathematical knowledge isn't just about manipulating concepts in your head. It requires constructing those concepts, visually demonstrating them in a way.
Constructing them, like drawing a triangle.
Sort of, but crucially, not necessarily on paper. He argued we do it in what he called pure intuition.
Okay, pure intuition. That sounds abstract.
It is a bit tricky, but it's absolutely central. Think of it as the underlying structure or framework within our minds that makes any sensory experience possible at all. Before you even perceive an object, your mind has a built-in way of organizing that perception.
And that built-in way is
space and time. For Kant, space and time aren't things out there in the world, properties of objects existing independently. They are the fundamental forms of our sensibility, the ways our minds structure any possible experience.
So like mental coordinate systems we impose.
Kind of, yeah. Geometry, Kant says, is based on our pure intuition of space. Arithmetic, dealing with counting, succession, units added one after another, is based on our pure intuition of time.
Wow, so why is that the key to math being synthetical a priori? How does saying space and time are in us help?
Because it gives those a priori constructions a place to happen. If space and time are the necessary forms of our intuition, then we can explore their structures purely a priori, and whatever we discover must apply to any object we could possibly experience, because any object has to appear to us within that framework of space and time.
Ah, okay. So we can make a geometrical proof, constructing it in our pure intuition of space.
Right, and because space is the form of all our outer intuition, the result of that proof will be necessarily true for any object we could encounter in space. It's synthetical because you're discovering properties through construction, not just definition. And it's a priori because you're doing it within the mind's own structure, not based on specific experiences.
So the judgments rely on this pure intuition to give them substance.
Exactly. Pure intuition provides the matter, the framework for these synthetical combinations to be made a priori. Without it, Kant thinks, you'd have no way to connect subject and predicate synthetically except through experience.
Does the source give examples of this reliance on intuition in math?
Yes, it mentions how proving geometric figures are congruent often involves showing they may be made to coincide. That act of mentally superimposing them relies on immediate intuition, and it has to be pure intuition for the proof to be universally necessary.
Not just, these two drawings look like they coincide.
Right. Or the fact that space has 3 dimensions based on how lines can intersect at right angles. Kant says this rests immediately on intuition. It's part of the fundamental structure we intuit, not something we deduce logically or measure empirically in every single case.
This is really turning things around. Math works because space and time are our ways of structuring things.
That's the radical takeaway. The certainty of math isn't because it perfectly mirrors an independent reality out there. It's because it explores the necessary structure of our own way of experiencing any reality. They're how things appear to us, conditioned by our minds.
Okay, so math is possible. What about science, like basic physics? Does he use a similar argument?
He does, yeah. He looks at the pure science of nature, fundamental principles like substance is permanent or every event has a cause according to constant laws. These are also treated as necessary, universal, a priori truths in science.
But again, where do they come from?
Yeah.
That's just experience, right?
Right. Hume already showed experience only gives us correlation, not necessity. And Kant adds, experience only tells us what is, not what must be. So these laws can't just be read off the world, nor can they be derived purely from things existing independently of us.
So the question becomes,
how can we know, before specific experiences, that objects we encounter will necessarily follow these fundamental laws? The source puts it as cognizing a priori that things as objects of experience conform to law.
and the answer is, again, looking inward.
Yes, by investigating the conditions that make experience itself possible. What does our mind need to do to turn raw sensory input into a coherent, objective experience of a world?
So it's not just receiving data, it's actively structuring it.
Exactly. Kant defines experience as the synthetical connection of phenomena, perceptions in consciousness, so far as this connection is necessary. To get that necessary connection, to move beyond just subjective feelings, it feels warm when the sun shines, to objective judgments, the sun causes warmth, we need more than just intuition, space and time. We need concepts.
Concepts to organize the perceptions.
Pure concepts, originating in the faculty of understanding itself. These are the famous categories.
Categories like causality, substance.
Yes, causality, substance, unity, plurality, possibility, necessity, a whole system of them. Think of them as the basic logical toolkit the understanding uses to structure experience. They are a priori built in.
So intuition gives the raw material structured by space and time, and the understanding applies the categories to make objective sense of it.
That's the picture. The categories are needed to take the perceptions organized by intuition and combine them into judgments of experience claims about an objective world as distinct from mere judgments of perception, which are just subjective reports. Applying the category of causality lets us link perceptions into necessary sequences, for example.
And this leads to that really radical claim about understanding in nature.
Yes, the Copernican revolution part. The source states it starkly. The understanding does not derive its laws a priori from, but prescribes them to nature.
Wow. Our understanding gives laws to nature.
To nature as an object of possible experience. Because the understanding, with its categories, provides the very structure that allows us to experience a law-governed objective world in the first place. Nature, as we experience it, must conform to these laws because they are the conditions for experiencing it.
So we know every event has a cause, a priori, because our understanding imposes that causal structure to make sense of events as experience.
That's precisely Kant's argument. It's a condition for the possibility of objective experience.
That just feels counterintuitive. Doesn't it make the law subjective?
Not subjective in the sense of arbitrary or just for me. They are objective in the sense that they are necessary conditions for any rational mind like ours to have coherent experience. They are universally necessary for us, for experience as we know it. What nature is in itself, apart from our structuring minds, we can't say. The source even suggests things like the properties of geometric figures, or maybe even aspects of universal gravitation, might ultimately derive from the conditions the understanding imposes when it constructs or determines space and time. It's about how we make unity and structure possible.
Okay, so math and science are possible because they operate within the structures our minds provide for experience.
Hmm.
Space, time, categories. They deal with objects of possible experience.
Right.
But what about those traditional metaphysical questions? The soul, the world as a whole, God. These aren't objects we can just bump into and experience.
Exactly. And this is where Kant introduces the third main cognitive faculty, reason, and its concepts, which he calls the ideas of reason.
Ideas, not categories.
Right. Ideas are pure concepts pushed to an extreme by reason's demand for absolute completeness, for the unconditioned. Think about logical arguments. Reason always wants the ultimate premise, the final explanation. These ideas, like the soul as an ultimate simple subject, the world as a complete totality, God as the absolute ground of everything, arise from this drive.
But they're different
Because, as the source says, they never can be given in any possible experience. There's no intuition, no perception that corresponds to the soul as a simple substance or the world as a finished whole.
And that's where the trouble starts.
That's where the danger lies. Reason is tempted to use these ideas, transcendently applying them beyond possible experience, trips to know things in themselves, noumena. But the categories only yield knowledge when applied to intuitions within experience. Using categories like substance or cause with ideas that have no corresponding intuition leads to illusion, to dialectic.
So trying to prove the soul is an immortal substance using categories is like using a hammer on thin air.
Kind of, yeah. You're applying tools designed for experience to something that, by definition, transcends experience. You get tangled in contradictions and paradoxes.
What are the main ideas Kant identifies?
The source outlines three main types linked to the forms of logical reasoning. First, the psychological idea, the soul. Reason seeks the ultimate unconditioned subject of all our thoughts and feelings. But we only experience changing states, and the category of substance only applies to objects in time and space. We can't prove the soul's permanence or simplicity this way.
Okay.
Second, the cosmological ideas, the world as a whole. Reason wants to know about the absolute beginning or limits of the world in time and space, its ultimate parts, whether there's freedom outside natural causality, whether there's a necessary being underpinning the chain of contingent things. But the world as a whole isn't an object of experience.
And third,
the theological idea, God. Reason seeks the absolute ground of all possibility, the ultimate unity underlying everything, the highest idea.
And these cosmological ideas about the world as a whole lead to a special kind of problem.
They do. They lead directly to the antinomies of pure reason. These are pairs of arguments, thesis and antithesis, about the world's totality, where reason seems perfectly capable of proving both sides of a contradiction.
Like proving the world is finite in time. A and D proving it's infinite in time.
Exactly. Or proving everything happens by necessary causal laws. A and D proving there must be freedom. Reason literally gets into a fight with itself.
That sounds bad, like a total breakdown of reason.
Kant actually sees it as incredibly valuable. He calls this conflict not arbitrarily invented, but founded in the nature of human reason. It's a decisive experiment that forces us to realize we've been making a fundamental mistake.
Which is?
The same mistake again. Applying concepts and principles that are only valid for appearances within experience, as if they could grasp the world as a thing in itself, as a completed totality independent of our experience.
Ah, so the contradiction arises from misapplying the tools.
Precisely. And resolving the antinomies involves recognizing this distinction. Kant groups them. First, the mathematical antinomies about the world's size and divisibility. Here, Kant argues both thesis and antithesis are false. Why? Because the very idea of the world as a completed whole existing before or outside our experience is self-contradictory when applied to appearances, which only exist in the process of being experienced.
So asking if the experienced world is really finite or infinite is like asking a nonsensical question.
Basically, yes. It treats appearances as things in themselves. Then there are the dynamical antinomies about causality, freedom, and necessity. Here, Kant argues both thesis and antithesis can be true, but in different senses applied to different realms.
How can both be true?
Natural necessity, every event has a cause in time, applies to things as appearances in the sensible world. But freedom could still be possible for the cause of those appearances, considered as a thing in itself, operating outside the time-bound causal chain of appearances.
So determinism for appearances, freedom possible for the underlying reality.
That's the possibility Kant opens up. They aren't contradictory if you apply them correctly, one to phenomena, the other potentially to noumena. Same logic applies to a necessary being as a cause of the world, noumenal, versus looking for one within the chain of appearances, phenomenal.
So the whole mess gets untangled by carefully distinguishing appearances from things in themselves.
Exactly. The source says the solution entirely rests upon the mistake of extending what is valid merely of appearances to things in themselves. Keep them separate, and the contradictions dissolve.
Okay, so if these ideas of reason, soul, world, God, don't give us actual knowledge of things in themselves, are they just useless, dangerous illusions?
Not useless, no. Kant argues they have a crucial regulative use. They don't constitute objects for our knowledge, but they guide the understanding in its work within experience.
Guided how?
They push the understanding to seek greater unity, completeness, and system in its empirical knowledge. The idea of a perfectly ordered natural system, for instance, encourages scientists to always look for broader laws, deeper connections, to treat nature as if it were a unified system, even if we never reach a final, absolute understanding.
So they act like goals or ideals for scientific inquiry.
Precisely. They guide the direction of research, and they also serve another vital function, marking the bounds of our reason.
Bounds, not limits. You mentioned that distinction from the source earlier. Remind me.
Right. A limit is just where something stops, a negation. But a bound implies there's something on the other side. The ideas, by pointing beyond possible experience, show us the boundary of our knowledge. They indicate there is a realm of things in themselves, noumena beyond appearances, even though our cognition, tied to sensibility and categories, can't penetrate it to gain definite knowledge.
So they fence off our knowledge, but also point to something beyond the fence.
That's a good way to put it. We know there's something there, but we can't know what it is in the way we know objects of experience.
What about the theological idea of God? How does that work regulatively?
Well, we can't know God's nature as a thing in itself. Projecting human understanding or will onto a supreme being constitutively is illegitimate, but the source suggests we can use analogy. We can think of God's relation to the world's order as being like the relation of human reason to a work of art. It helps us think about a highest cause or ground in relation to the world's purposiveness without claiming literal knowledge of God's inner being.
It's a way to think about it without claiming to know it definitively.
Exactly. It respects the bounds. And this critical approach does important work. It allows us to think concepts like freedom or a necessary being as possible by placing them outside the deterministic realm of appearances without making illegitimate knowledge claims. And, Kant argues, it undercuts dogmatic materialism or fatalism, which make the mistake of assuming appearances are the only reality.
So, bringing it all together, after all this groundwork, analyzing judgment, intuition, categories, ideas, antinomies, Kant believes he's finally shown how metaphysics can be a science.
That's the promise, yes. To provide the foundation it always lacked.
And why wasn't it a science before, in his eyes? What was wrong with, say, Leibniz or Wolff?
He saw previous metaphysics, according to the source, as mostly piecework, just random bungling attempts. They either got stuck just analyzing concepts, which is analytical, not synthetical knowledge, or they jumbled up concepts from sensibility, understanding, and reason without knowing their proper sources or limits.
No clear map of the mind's faculties and their jurisdiction.
Exactly. No definite system of categories, no clear deduction showing why these concepts apply and where they apply.
The source mentions metaphysics had fallen into disrepute.
Yeah, no longer numbered among thorough sciences, even mocked. But Kant insists the need for it, the drive for those ultimate answers, is inextinguishable in us. Without a proper science of metaphysics, people just invent their own unfounded systems.
So the critique, which the Prolegomena summarizes, is meant to be that science's foundation.
Yes. By laying out the entire system of a priori concepts, where they come from, sensibility, understanding, reason, what they are, space-time, categories, ideas, analyzing them, and crucially, showing their deduction, their legitimate application only to possible experience, it provides the necessary framework.
A standard for judging metaphysical claims.
A standard to our judgment, the source says, whereby knowledge may be with certainty distinguished from pseudoscience and firmly founded. It aims to give metaphysics rigor.
And he really thought this system was complete, finished.
That's the really bold claim. The source suggests Kant believed this science could reach completion and an enduring state because it's based on mapping reason itself, not on ever-changing external discoveries. Since reason's structure is finite, it can, in principle, be fully charted.
Offering sure prospect of knowledge so definite and so compact. Quite the claim.
It really is.
Wow. Okay, so that was quite the journey through Kant's Prolegomena. We started with Hume waking Kant up to the crisis.
The dogmatic slumber, yeah.
Then Kant's analysis of judgments, leading to that key problem. How are synthetical judgments a priori possible?
The problem metaphysics stands or falls on.
And his revolutionary answer. It's possible because of the structure of our own minds, our pure intuitions, space and time, and our pure concepts, the categories. These structure experience itself.
Making math and pure science possible because they deal with objects conforming to our mental framework.
Then we hit the tricky part. The ideas of reason, soul, world, God, which push for completeness but lead to illusion and antinomies when applied beyond experience.
Right, the danger zone of trying to know things in themselves.
But Kant finds a way out, resolving the antinomies by distinguishing appearances from things in themselves and giving the ideas a positive regulative role.
Guiding science and marking the bounds of our knowledge, leaving conceptual space for things like freedom without claiming direct knowledge.
And the end goal. Establishing metaphysics as a true science, finally, with a solid foundation based on a critique of reason itself.
Understanding prescribing laws to nature, as experienced by us. A total perspective shift.
It really is. So after all that, what's the big takeaway? The thing to really chew on?
Well, consider this. Drawing right from Kant's core idea. If the very possibility of objective knowledge, the fact that science works, the fact that math is certain, if all that rests on the fundamental built-in structures of your own mind, your intuitions of space and time, your categories of understanding, how does that change how you think about the connection between the world out there and the cognitive machinery in here? What does it really mean for our relationship to reality?